if you want to go back to it and listen to key parts, or for those individuals who are unable to join us today. We will stop at different points throughout the presentation to check for clarity. And in doing so, all of you are automatically muted and do not have video conference capabilities. And so we ask that if you have questions to please put those in the Q&A function of the webinar. And our moderators will go through those Q&As and ask your questions, and we will respond to those. We will also use the chat function so that we can offer some follow-up responses to questions that may arise. At the end of the presentation, we will have a discussion, and if you have a question or comment at that time, please use the raise hand icon, which can be found when you click on the participant icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen, shown here in this image, and the moderator will call your name and unmute your phone line so that you may ask your question. So I first want to introduce the research team. We've been working together for many years, both in developing the concept for this study. So it's been about, it seems about 5 years since we started this endeavor. I want to start with our Keck project manager, Kathy Avila-Lynn. There she is, waving. And Kathy is also a consultant with the Center for Community Engagement. And then our research arm of the endeavor is Cobblestone Applied Research and Evaluation, and that includes Dr. Rebecca Eddy, who is the CEO and president of Cobblestone, as well as Nicole Galpart, the research associate. So during today's webinar, we will have an overview of the service learning courses in STEM. We will share with you the research questions and the study overview concept. We will also discuss the high quality service learning factors that are pervasive in our study findings and implications. And then we will also go into and describe a secondary data analysis that we conducted because our study was limited in many ways, which Rebecca will talk about in a little bit later. We will then, as I mentioned, open it up for more robust discussion with all of you. I also really want to thank those who were part of this study. The faculty, the IR offices, the deans from the 10 campuses who participated. That included Dominguez Hills, Los Angeles, Fresno, Monterey Bay, Cal State Northridge, Sac State, San Jose State, Stanislaus, San Marcos, and Pomona. Without everyone's participation, we really wouldn't be able to do this study. I also really have to send a special thank you out to CSU Monterey Bay's IRB office, because Cindy Lopez took on the Herculean task of serving as our IRB lead institution. And Jennifer Bliss and Chip Leno worked with me monthly to go over our IRB reports and really appreciated all of their assistance as I learned and continued to report on our progress. Lastly, I really want to thank my staff here at the center, Christina Barger, and in particular Tracy Reed and Brianna Wagner from our Cal State S4 database system, who were instrumental in working with the campus key masters as well as my team in securing our data. So in 2012, the President's Council of Advisors of Science and Teaching wrote a report called Engage to Excel, which stated that 1 million more science, technology, engineering, and math college graduates were needed in the next 10 years for the U.S. to remain a global leader in science and engineering. As the largest and most diverse university system in the country, the CSU plays a critical role in meeting this need. In light of the CSU's 20-year commitment to service learning, we believe service learning in particular could provide engaging and meaningful experiences for our STEM students that would bring their courses to life. Therefore, in 2010, we began a system-wide effort to increase the number of STEM service learning courses offered across the system. By the time we began our research study in 2014, the number of STEM service learning courses was at 673 courses, up from 264 in 2009. While our efforts had paid off to increase the number of service learning courses offered, we wanted to know more about the quality of those courses and whether STEM service learning experiences had positive impacts on students' civic engagement and their career interests. This was the basis for our research questions, which Rebecca will go into detail in the next few minutes. But first, I want to share a few more important stats with you so that you understand the landscape that helped to shape our study and the CSU's current effort as part of Graduation Initiative 2025. This slide shows the data at the conclusion of the CSU's 2015 Graduation Initiative for the entering 2010 cohort, which, as you know, has informed the CSU's ambitious Graduation 2025 initiative goals to ensure that all students have the opportunity to be successful and graduate according to their personal goals, positively impacting their and California's economy. This includes eliminating the achievement gap. As you can see here, we ended 2015 not reaching our goal and leaving it at a 12.5% gap. This effort also includes increasing four-year graduation rates for first-time freshmen from 19% to 40%, and six-year graduation rates to 70% from 59% as shown here. Goals for our transfer students are as ambitious, including increasing two-year rates to 45% from 31% in 2015, and four-year rates to 85%. To achieve these goals, it will require collaboration across our institutions and in partnership with our communities. The CSU's 20-year commitment to community engagement and service learning are critical key components to this effort. In 2016, the CSU served more than 125,000 STEM students and conferred 20,201 STEM baccalaureates. However, the CSU STEM graduation rates are much lower than the national average. Of the 25% of first-time freshmen who declared a STEM major at entry in 2010, only 38% of those students persisted and graduated in STEM in 6 years. These figures drastically decrease for groups of students who are historically and currently underrepresented in STEM fields. 26% of African American, Native American, and Hispanic students, 27% of first-generation students, 30% of students from low-income families, and 35% of women graduate within 6 years with a STEM degree. While each of your campuses has a definition of service learning, this is the system's definition, which provided the context for how we approached our study. In that, service learning, the way it's defined in the system office, is that it provides opportunities for students to participate in organized service activities that meet community needs that are linked to the community service experience, to the course content through reflective activities. This is critical because you will see later how some of these components match some of our findings. Our students do not receive financial compensation, and the service learning placement is a critical component of the course material, but it does not embody the entirety of the course. It is important to know that since 1998, the CSU has seen a 114% increase in service learning courses across all disciplines. For the purposes of this study, I want to now show you where we are in terms of STEM service learning course growth since 2009. Since 1998, the C has, I already said that. This particular chart highlights how service learning in STEM disciplines have developed since we began efforts to increase STEM service learning courses in 2010. And you can see that we had quite a few levels of growth up into 2015, and then a slight decline in 2017. And part of this is that we've been making a concerted effort to address disparities within our data collection methods. And so we are refining the information that we have so that we can really have a clear picture of what is truly taking place across the system. As shown here, national research shows that service learning positively impacts student retention, graduation, and civic engagement participation. Increasing access to service learning courses, particularly from students from historically underserved communities, can support campus efforts to close equity gaps, decrease time to degree, and increase completion rates. Within the CSU, this annually equates to 67,000 students. That's approximately 14% of our student body, having the opportunity to participate in a service learning experience. And while these numbers are impressive, we are equally, if not more so, focused on the quality of the experiences, which then impacts the students' development and engagement in the CSU and beyond. This is a perfect segue to our study's research, focus, and design. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Rebecca Eddy.
Thanks, Judy. So today I'm going to talk about the research study and describe a little bit the first original study that we designed, as Judy mentioned, that started in 2014, was a quasi-experimental design and really compared students who were in service learning courses with those students who were in similar science courses that were not service learning. And we collected a lot of this information via the S4 database and recruited faculty and their students, as well as other control students in these courses over this time period. So we'll kind of go into some of the things that we did. Obviously, the setup and everything happened in 2014, and we are right now in sort of our dissemination phase. We also, based on some of the responses that we got from our original study, we decided to add another component to this because we feel like we did not have enough of a sample, particularly in our control group. So we did an additional secondary data analysis, and Judy will describe the results of that secondary data analysis that was done by the Chancellor's Office that we added to original research study design, just because we thought we could better tap into some longer-term outcomes for retention and graduation based on some of the data that we were lacking. So we wanted to just kind of sort of outline what happened in the original study before we give the results. So if you click on the next slide, again, this is just sort of a quick overview. We did the setup, all the instrument development, all the IRB applications, everything else we did in summer of 2014. We started collecting data over 5 terms all the way through fall 2016. Doing analyses along the way, and then again, as I mentioned, we're in our dissemination phase. So we actually had 3 major cohorts of students across these different academic years, and we broke some of the data up into cohorts and then combined where possible. So you'll see some of those throughout our explanation of results. If you go to the next slide, we wanted to talk a little bit about study recruitment because we thought that's kind of important to understand how we actually had students and faculty in the study. So for the treatment group in particular, we had faculty. Originally, we did outreach by email and phone to several STEM faculty on CSU campuses that were already using the S4 data collection system. And this was our primary way of collecting data in the study through the S4 system. And we had interested faculty members. We gave them information about the study and then asked them to complete an MOU and provided pre-testing materials. And these faculty were also required to attend a webinar that gave some information about the study. Once they agreed to participate, we actually had them request that students in their courses participate as a consequence of this. And we were able to administer pre-test surveys to several students who volunteered to be part of the study in their course sections in the first couple weeks of class. And then of those who filled out the pre-test, we actually provided the same links to a post-test at the end of the term. that's how we recruited treatment group faculty and students. For the control group, it was a little bit different. Obviously, we don't have other sort of clean cohorts. For those recruited in the STEM service learning courses, we actually contacted deans and other STEM faculty in those departments to be able to determine some other courses that were non-service learning but were sort of at similar levels that students would take. And then we were recruiting or contacting students directly through email to be able to participate as control group students. And so once we established all of those things, then we were able to provide incentives for students in the form of Amazon gift cards as a small incentive for the student participation. And then faculty receive stipends for their participation, the STEM service learning faculty, treatment faculty in particular. Okay, so basically that's how we did it, but we wanted to kind of set up too to let you know what we were trying to figure out in the study. As Judy mentioned, we really want to understand what the landscape of service learning STEM courses in the CSU looked like, given that the fact that we know that there's a sort of a wide range of interpretations of what should actually be a part of a service learning course and lots of different literature. We wanted to know for our sample, again, STEM courses in the CSU, what were the common underlying elements in those service learning courses. And we also wanted to know to what degree are some of these more essential elements of high quality service learning really present in the participating courses. So that's part of what we want to understand in terms of the implementation. And the next slide, you'll see some of the outcome questions that we're interested in answering. So for example, does service learning in STEM has a positive impact on student success in these primary areas? And I'll go over the instruments in a minute, but essentially we're looking at academic achievement, career development, civic engagement. We also wanted to know if there were different results depending on the quality of the service learning course. So again, we were able to do some coding to be able to determine which courses were more high quality or met more the criteria for high quality, and then compare those outcomes for students in comparison to those who are of lower quality, according to our coding. And then finally, this is just sort of a longer term overall question. Does service learning in STEM disciplines really promote access for these students who are traditionally underrepresented? So we wanted to try to answer all of these questions in our study. If you go to the next slide, again, this is sort of the full range of questions that were sort of broken down, and we'll go through each of those as we go through our results. Just to give you a little bit of an idea too, the next slide is our hypotheses. Based on the research literature and how we designed the study, we expected that service learning experiences would allow students to essentially acquire technical skills, increase their interest in STEM careers, improve their attitudes and behaviors around STEM, and civic engagement. So that was our sort of best case scenario, right? Assuming that they had a good high quality experience. And ultimately, we expected this participation to lead to greater retention and majors, higher graduation rates in STEM fields, and increased civic engagement beyond the college years. So as you could probably tell, only having 3 years of study, it was harder to be able to answer those questions, and it's something that we perhaps can do over the years to see some of these longer-term effects, but this is essentially where we're going with our hypotheses. If you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the measures that we used. In pre-testing, we had faculty complete a pre-test survey, basically answering the questions about their course. At the start of the course, some of the background information, their discipline, their expectations regarding the course. For example, is the service learning component optional or required for students? That's something that faculty were able to determine. And then their importance of teaching the course in terms of pedagogy or engaging students or filling community need. We wanted to know these things before they got started. We also, as I mentioned, had student pre-testing, and we gave them, administered a couple of different scales. One was a civic engagement survey, and if you're familiar with the literature, it's the Doolittle and Fall 2013. And this relates to both attitudes and behaviors for civic engagement. So we'll go over those results separately. And then we also administered the STEM student career interest and awareness survey, and this is a Tyler Wood et al. 2010, about attitudes and career interests within their own field in STEM. So that's something that students did pre-post, and then we also, in addition to that, had a post-test measure for both faculty and students that were similar about some of the particular issues, particular elements that were covered within the course in service learning, and those we actually used to be able to code both faculty and student responses to see the level of sort of coordination or overlap that students and faculty perceived, as well as give a little bit more information about some of these essential constructs that were present within the service learning course. So those were the instruments primarily. In addition to that, we had the help, as Judy mentioned. Thank you again for all the institutional research offices that help provide student data each term, and then we did follow up in terms of retention and graduation throughout the term, especially for the first couple cohorts. We were able to get grades and other critical information, demographic information through the IR offices. So that was pretty critical in being able to do some of these analysis. The other element that we did was we had an expert in service learning code each syllabus that was part of the study. And then this person used the Heffernan 2001 sort of coding scheme to be able to determine, fundamentals of service learning that were present, at least reflected in the syllabus. And then we'll look at those ratings today. And then finally, as I mentioned too, the secondary data analysis, because we had a pretty low response rate in our control group, we actually were able to have our treatment group and then do a really nice, matched control using propensity score matching to be able to determine an adequate control group for some of these treatment students who we've examined, particularly in a couple of the cohorts that happened early on. And so Judy will go over those results today too, but that was basically in addition to our original design that we think added something to our understanding of some of these longer term measures that we did throughout the study. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the sample questions that we did. For example, in faculty questions, is this your first service learning course? What kinds of student learning outcomes do you expect to have? Again, these are some of the options that we did as sort of the pre-test measure. And then wanted to know more specifically about how community need was identified, how service learning is integrated into curriculum. And so these, again, corresponded to the dimensions, the key dimensions that we're looking at. And then we also, again, here's an example of some student questions on the scale, the agreement, Likert scale, 5 points of, feel responsibility for the community. I believe I should make a difference in my community. So these are some of these civic engagement attitude questions. And then we asked other questions about their experience in the course as well. So I'm now going to turn it over to Kathy Avila-Lynn, who's going to describe a little bit more about these key components that we've referred to that were adapted from the research literature on service learning. And she'll explain a little bit more about our methodology and how we develop that.
Thanks, Rebecca. So again, like Rebecca said, I'm going to share a little bit about how we identified the dimensions of service learning. First thing we did is we surveyed the literature and looked at what existed, and we culled the essential elements that had already been identified in the field. From this, we developed a list of 15 areas that included things like reflection, community need, a link to learning outcomes, academic content, etc. And then from there, we developed a survey items for the students and for the faculty service learning surveys that we used. And the goal at this point was to statistically combine items into a smaller number of scales, which would comprise the overall quality of the service learning experience. The next thing we did is we checked to see which items were strongly related to one another. And after that initial analysis, we really didn't have any kind of a clear pattern. And so we took another step, and we had two of the raters from the research team took a look at the surveys as well as the literature and determine which survey items needed to go together in terms, again, in which were related to one another. And this allowed us as a team to statistically test whether these items And the groupings were, in fact, representative of distinct components of quality, again, based on the, the research team's review of what seemed to go together. So based on that initial review, 6 components of quality were identified, and frequency of communication, quality of reflections, addressing community need, course linked to academic content, degree of service learning preparation, and values focus. And then we took the student ratings of the questions and we developed internal consistencies for components that had 2 or more questions to determine the relationship between the items, again, to see which ones belong together. And then we were able to perform reliability analysis for each of them, and we have multiple items for most categories. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. On the next slide, you will see the 8 elements that we came up with. I'll just read through: learning objectives, community need, collaboration with community, reflection, academic content, values focus, service learning preparation, and communication with community. And again, these emerged from the literature and from the student ratings and from that initial analysis that we did. And you'll see these again later as we talk through our findings. So here on this slide, you can see the reliabilities of each of the elements. And so if you take a look, you can see that for reflections, we had 5 questions that went along and were connected to that idea and that element. And it goes down from there, 4, 3, 2. And at the very bottom, we only had 1 question for service learning preparation and for learning objectives. Again, you can see in that far right column the reliability of each of these components, whereas again, reflection is high, 0.94, and values focus right behind it with a 0.92. At the bottom, you can see that we weren't able to find any reliability there. And so, so the limitations we discovered is that we just don't have enough questions in each of these categories. And so if we were to do this work in the future and use these same surveys that we created, it would really require us to develop more questions in each category, just in terms of consistency. Really quickly, I want to share 2 examples of the kinds of questions that we use in relationship to the different elements. So here's an example of collaboration with community. Again, the reliability here was 0.88. And I'll just read the questions. To what extent did collaboration take place between the faculty and community partner, between the students and community partner, and between the students and the faculty? So that just gives you a sense of what those questions look like. And we have one more quick example on the next slide, focused on values. And again, this reliability again was 0.92. And we were looking at, to what extent did you explore how your social identity is similar and different from the community members you served? To what extent did you acknowledge and analyze a power imbalance in the service learning experience? And to what extent did you connect your knowledge and values to those with whom you served? Again, that's a reliability of 0.92. And again, for each of these different elements, we asked students and we asked faculty same questions. And we looked for those consistencies between the 2 to determine the ratings. So at this point, I'm going to just check in and see if there are any questions that have come in, or if there's anything that needs clarity before we ask Nicole to talk a little bit more about the process. Is there anything that needs clarity?
Kathy, I'm not seeing any questions. There was 1 question, but Rebecca answered it in the chat.
Wonderful. All right, so Nicole, let you keep going.
Sounds good. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So one thing that I do want to reiterate before I jump in is I wanted to thank again everyone from especially the institutional research offices. I worked pretty closely with them, and I am so grateful for all of the help that they gave in collecting some of this absolutely vital and essential data. So thank you very much. I wanted to go over just very quickly our analysis procedure of all of the data that we collected. So some of these were already mentioned. but I did want to draw your attention to these 4 different types of analyses. The first one is the overall quality rating. So when we go through the results, you're going to be hearing quality of service learning or quality rating. When we're talking about that, for the most part, we are talking about the student quality rating. And the way that this was calculated is that we, based on our survey results, went through and took the average score for each one of those components by cluster, and I will explain what cluster means in just a second, and then assigned it either a low, medium, or high quality score of service learning based on each one of those components that Kathy talked about. We also looked at the quality for faculty members, but because we didn't have as much data from faculty members, because it's a smaller group, we did go with the student rating because we had more data there. We do want to note, however, that we found that there was a high correlation between students and faculty members when rating the quality of service learning in these courses. As Rebecca mentioned, we also had an independent coder go through each one of the syllabus, each syllabus that we had, and assign it a quality rating. And then finally, we have our secondary data analysis, which, as Rebecca had mentioned, Judy will talk about in just a bit. So going over who was actually participating in our study, and I don't know if anyone that participated is there in listening. If so, thank you. We had 10 different campuses that participated, as Judy mentioned earlier, with 47 different treatment faculty members. So these are faculty members that were teaching service learning courses. And this resulted in 2,152 student responses. I will note that we had 2,065 individual unique students that participated, but due to the design of the research study, it was possible that some students could participate multiple times in taking surveys. Which meant that it was really important for us on our end to be really mindful in tracking students to see if they enrolled in a treatment course and then maybe a control course, and if that was the case, then we did not include their control data, but then also seeing if maybe they participated in 2 treatment courses or in 2 control courses. And what this kind of boiled down to was our system and our analysis of clusters. So what clusters were is our unit of analysis in that we may have had 47 faculty members participating, but it was possible that they, throughout the course of the study, taught multiple service learning courses. And sometimes they taught the same course within the same semester or same quarter. So if that happened, what we did is we treated those courses as being the same, if they were the same course but with different sections, because in theory the syllabus is the same, the assignments were the same, the way that the course was treated was identical. So we simply just grouped those students into one cluster for our cluster analysis. When we're looking at STEM courses, we were using the NSF definition of STEM with the exception of social sciences. So some STEM service learning courses and departments include biology, engineering, nutrition, environmental studies. And we did find that when we were looking at our clusters, the majority of them were upper division clusters. And on the next slide, we have the overall demographic information for the students that were participating. So you can see the majority, it was a pretty split, about 53% were male. There is a little portion there that is unknown just through data collection purposes. We weren't able to identify that for a small handful of students. About 40% are underrepresented minority students, about half were Pell eligible, and about 80% were STEM majors, which does make sense if we are looking at STEM courses and STEM service learning courses. We did want to note, however, that this is fairly similar to the overall CSU demographic composition. And on the next slide, what we wanted to do, although most of these findings are going to be based off of the student quality ratings, we did want to give you kind of a brief understanding of some of the questions that we also asked faculty members. So for the treatment faculty members, those that were teaching STEM service learning courses, we wanted to know how important different elements were when designing these service learning course projects. We found that overwhelmingly 96% of the faculty members, which were 47, said that engaging students was really important, very important. They also found, or stated rather, that the relevance to the course subject as well as relevance to academic objectives was very important. And you see at the bottom, while it was somewhat important, but things like availability or just simple convenience and personal interest were not as important when designing these courses. We also asked about different learning objectives, and we can see that this kind of mirrors what we found on the previous slide, where something that was important and student faculty members were focusing on frequently was engagement with course content and application of course content. But you can see that all of these items, including a deeper meaning of course content and knowledge of community issues, were all things that were stressed fairly frequently or sometimes with each faculty member. And earlier we had mentioned looking at the syllabus for each course that participated. And so what we found is that service learning is varying greatly across the CSU campuses, both in the number and catalog of courses, but also in quality. So in looking at the syllabus, what was found is that it was kind of all over in terms of the quality. So we have on the left-hand side, we had a fair number of syllabuses that were rated as being very low quality. And so what that often meant is that a syllabus, when it was being coded, some of these elements of service learning were not present, so that they then receive maybe like a 0. Whereas then you see on the right-hand side, we did also have a fair number of syllabuses that were rated as high, so that we could see that there was a lot of, it was evident that it was a service learning course based off of the syllabus. And I wanted to really quick check in to see if there's questions at this point.
Yes, Karina Sass asks, in terms of quality of experience of or from students, was there any analysis and or findings related to the instructor surveys that are done at the end of each semester vis-a-vis the courses they took?
So, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that was it.
Okay, so if I am understanding your question correctly, while we did do the quality of experience for the students, and that's what we used for most of the analyses moving forward, we did give almost an identical survey to all of the faculty members, addressing the quality of the experience from their point of view as well. And I say almost identical in that the only thing that was changed was the wording in terms of you as a student or you as a faculty member. So we also then looked at that. We compared the findings between the instructor rating of quality and the student rating of quality, and we found that there was a high correlation between the two. So I hope that that answers your question. If not, write something back in the Q&A and then we can address it in just a bit. So kind of switching from faculty to students, we wanted to know why students were participating in these service learning courses. Because this wasn't a randomized control trial, we were not randomly assigning students to take a specific course. It was important for us to know their motivation for joining these courses. We found that about 50% of students said that it was part of their academic program and that it was required. About 35% of students said it sounded interesting or it fit my course schedule. We did think that it was interesting on our end that about 16% of students that were participating in these courses did not know that it was a service learning course at the time that they registered. So although we do know that some students were required to take this course as part of their program, it also gave us a lot of information to know that a fairly big percentage of these students actually didn't know that it was a service learning course. And so now I want to dig a little bit deeper into what we mean by the quality of experience and quality of service learning courses. So as Kathy had mentioned earlier, we have these 8 different essential elements. And based on the average scores of the quality of experience for these students, we then assign them, as I mentioned, low, medium, and high. So this is what the distribution looks like for each one of those essential elements. The percentage of clusters that were rated as a high quality cluster in terms of being linked to academic content or addressing community need, low quality, medium, and high quality. So you can see that overall students thought that the courses were highly linked to academic objectives, learning objectives and addressing the community need. And although about 31% of the students did say that they had a high quality experience with communication with the community, that one showed a much more of an even distribution between high, medium, and low. And on the next slide, we'll get into some of the actual study findings. So what we ended up finding was that students who participated in the service learning courses reported higher civic engagement attitudes at post-test than the control students. And this is a statistically significant finding, meaning that when we are doing these analyses, we know that there's always a chance that while we think that it may be even, but we know that there's a chance that we'll find something. And when we're doing significance testing, we're trying to see how likely are we to find a answer or a result this extreme outside of chance. So we're looking for statistically significant findings. So we did find that students that participated in service learning had higher learning objectives, higher civic engagement attitudes at post-test. A general finding is that we found that students' interest in STEM related careers was more based on their own major than whether they participated in service learning, and that makes sense, especially because 80% of the students in our study were STEM majors, so we would think that hopefully they have an interest in STEM related careers. But it was important for us to look at that to make sure to know if that's something that we needed to account for in our other analyses. And when we did account for it, we did find that STEM service learning students, their STEM career interests actually increased from pre-test to post-test, while the control students actually decreased from pre-test to post-test. And we have that on the next slide. And as an honest researcher, I'm going to draw your attention to 2 things on this slide before I talk about the results. The first is on the left-hand side. This axis does not start at 0, and that is because while this is a small, it's a meaningful change, it's relatively small in terms of the numbers, as you can see there from the data labels. So we blew it up so that you could see the difference. The second is that our ends are slightly uneven, but it did meet the assumptions necessary in order to run this analysis. So you can see on the top there in the yellow color is the control students, and they are slightly decreasing from pre-test to post-test, as opposed to the treatment students who are in these service learning courses are actually slightly increasing from pre-test to post-test. So it was interesting for us that although the control students had slightly higher scores or interest in career interest in STEM, the treatment students were increasing over time. So now that we've kind of done a brief overview of some of the outcomes and kind of some of the brief findings, we wanted to look at each one of these elements and if they would predict some of these outcomes that we're interested in. So before we were looking at it kind of as a whole, now we're looking at each one of these elements. And what we ended up finding is that when it came to predicting civic engagement attitudes, collaboration, being linked directly to academic content, and a focus on values all predicted more positive civic engagement attitudes. When we did another analysis to see what the strongest predictors were, we saw that collaboration and being linked directly to academic content were the strongest predictors. We also found, and this was a surprise to us, that the frequency and quality of communication actually predicted less positive civic engagement attitudes, in that the students that reported the most frequent communication between at all levels actually had slightly lower civic engagement attitudes compared to their peers. We did the same analyses when predicting civic engagement behavior. And again, we found collaboration, being linked to academic content, and a focus on values were all positive predictors. When we did the other analysis to see what the strongest predictor was, we actually found that it was focus on values, but in this analysis, it didn't reach the threshold of statistical significance. And finally, we did the analysis for STEM career interest, and we found that being linked directly to academic content was the strongest predictor. So throughout all three of these, it looks like, based on the data, being linked directly to academic content was the strongest predictor for each one of these outcomes, which does make sense when we think back to some of the slides that we showed earlier with the faculty focus. In terms of what they said was important, large percentages of the faculty members were emphasizing a connection to academic content and the academic objectives. All right. And on the next slide, we wanted to show some information for our follow-up survey. So as Rebecca mentioned, we did a pre-test and a post-test right after the course. But we also wanted to see, well, are there any trends over time 1 year later? And what we ended up finding was that there was another interaction. So again, my same caveats that I mentioned before, these scales, the axis does not start at 0, and our ends are slightly different, but do meet the assumptions for these tests. We see that in both cases for STEM career interest as well as civic engagement attitudes, the control students start slightly higher than the treatment students at pre-test. During the follow-up 1 year later, however, we see that both the treatment students for both of these outcomes actually increased while the control students decreased, and increased to the extent where they were actually reporting more civic engagement attitudes and more STEM career interest. And on our next slide, we wanted to also go over the overall quality of the service learning experience. So before we were looking at the quality of each one of those different components, now we're looking at the overall quality of the cluster. And so we assigned each cluster, as we mentioned before, a low quality, high quality, and medium quality score or label. And what we found when we looked to see if there were any differences between groups, we found that there were moderate differences, but nothing significant. But then because we saw that there were maybe some changes, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper. So we did some pairwise comparisons, which we have on the next slide. And as you can see, students in those high quality clusters reported on average significantly more civic engagement attitudes than those in the medium quality clusters. Those students also reported significantly more civic engagement behaviors compared to those in the low quality courses. And so while we didn't see anything with STEM career interests, we were interested to see that the students in the high quality clusters were reporting more civic engagement attitudes and behaviors than low quality courses. And at this point, I also wanted to, I know it's a lot of information that I'm giving you right now for the results, but I wanted to see if there was any other questions, or have they all been answered?
It does look like all the questions have been answered, but I'm unclear if the participants are able to see the answer that Rebecca gave in text, so I'm just going to respond to, just read it for everybody. Karina and Juan just wanted a little more clarity. They were, in their original question, what they were getting at was, did you look at the evaluations that each campus provides to students at the end of the semester? And Rebecca let them know that that was not part of the analysis. So just FYI to everybody.
Great.
Oh, and yeah, they got a thank you. All right, we're good.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Judy to talk a little bit more about the secondary data analysis that we did as part of the study.
Thank you, Nicole. So as you know, some of the outcomes that we were really interested in looking at, we weren't able to tap into based on the original design in terms of the study we were sending to students. Therefore, we conducted a secondary data analysis working with Dr. Erin DeSantis from here at the Chancellor's Office and Dr. Gold's Office of Academic Research and Student Success to pull in all treatment students and then pull in information of all control students. And we did, she conducted a propensity score matching to be able to establish an appropriate comparison control group to the treatment group. What we found in terms of retention and graduation for first-time freshmen, 4-year retention rates for the two cohorts that were available, the 2010 and the 2011 cohort, the treatment group had slightly higher retention rates than the control group, about 4%. 4-year graduation rates, the 2011 cohort, the control group had slightly higher graduation rates. But for the 2012 cohort, that is flipped, with the treatment group graduating at a slightly higher rate. For the CSU, it is important to note that 4-year graduation rates are not the norm in terms of our STEM degree programs. And in the next slide, we'll show you 6-year retention and graduation rates for the cohorts we have recent data for. This slide shows that for both the 2010 and the 2011 cohorts, treatment students were retained at a slightly higher percentage rate, 6 to 7 percentage points, than the treatment students. Than the control students, my apologies there. We can also see that for the 2010 cohort, treatment students graduated at a much higher rate than their comparison control students by 34 percentage points. But in 2011, we see that the gap has decreased slightly by only 8 percentage points. As this graph shows, non-URM treatment and control perform similarly. However, our URM students in service learning classes did much better in their 6-year graduation rates than their matched peers in non-service learning classes. This is really good, and it supports the idea that service learning coursework matters for URM students. It is important to note that we did not only have first-time freshmen in our study sample, we also had transfer students. So in looking at the transfer students, 4-year graduation rates is more commonly done given that they've had prior experience before transferring into the institution. For the most recent data we have available, the 2010, 2011, and 2012 cohorts, The students that were in the treatment groups, as you can see here, were graduating at a higher rate than the control students in all 3 cohorts. I will pause and see if we have any questions around the secondary data analysis.
Karina did ask a quick question of what a URM is. Rebecca responded, but just for everybody else, it's underrepresented minority students.
And I will add that URM is defined in the CSU as African American, Latino, Hispanic, and Native American. Okay, and with that, we are going to be opening the lines up for discussion, so I'm going to turn that over to Kathy.
Absolutely. Thanks, Judy. So at this time, we just wanted to hear a little bit from you, and we're interested in if there were any of the findings that you're thinking you might apply to your work or to broader community engagement efforts on your campus, and however you want to think about it. I mean, just looking at the list of attendees today, you know, we have folks from academic technology, you know, folks who are thinking about, the design of courses and curriculum. We have deans, we have lots of directors of community engagement and community partner coordinators, lots of professors, a couple of folks who are looking at the system, system-wide work. So we're just interested in kind of if there's anything that you heard today that you're going to think more about and perhaps apply to your own work.
Kathy, there is a Q&A that came in.
Okay.
Were the URM's results disaggregated by race or ethnicity, and did they show any difference? Oh, and it does look like Rebecca just responded to that.
I just answered. Yeah, I think because that was a really low N, they could not do it by other subgroups. So that was specifically related to the analysis, the secondary data analysis that Chancellor's office did. If I'm thinking that's what the question is about. Yeah, and it was pretty low N. Again, we're talking like 86 and 68, so not enough to disaggregate.
Thanks, Rebecca.
And did you look at any research? I'm sorry. Did you look at any gender differences?
Same with it for these students. I do not believe that Erin had any gender differences within the secondary data analysis.
This one was posed by a different person. My guess is they meant in general, not just.
Oh, got it. Good question. Oh, Diane, good question. Nicole, I don't know. Can we answer that question?
So we didn't see any, and we ended up, when we were doing our analyses, we ended up controlling for gender. In our analyses, we looked at, because we were looking at all of these different clusters, the more that we would parse it out, the smaller our ends would get. So we ended up in some of these analyses controlling for gender, as well as ethnicity and SES.
Great question. Are there others? Anything else you want us to go back to, and anything you want to check out further or clarify?
None are coming in currently.
Thanks, Brianna.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go ahead then and direct us back to this first question for discussion. We're interested in hearing from you all. Again, if there's anything that you heard, in the findings that you are thinking you would want to, again, think more about or potentially apply to your own work. Did anything jump out at any of you?
I'm just going to remind folks that if you raise your hand, then we can unmute your phone line so that we can hear directly from you.
Thanks, Judy.
Yep, still nothing coming in just yet.
I'm going to go ahead and just read these other two questions just for the good of the group, and just as you're thinking, how might these results inform the conversations that are taking place on your campus about critical issues related to teaching and learning? And then that final question, what ideas come to mind for enhancing service learning practices on your campus or system-wide, based on what you've heard? And I think we just had a question come in from Cheryl.
Yep. Do you want me to?
You want to go ahead? Sure.
Yeah. Cheryl says, I certainly want to share the data on URM as this particularly applies to our campus. This is awesome, and I can hardly wait until we are allowed to share. Our administration has been particularly interested in retention and graduation, as shown in data with our students such as Jumpstart, Justice Corps, etc. So these findings should knock their socks off.
That's awesome, Cheryl. Thanks for sharing that. And as we share this information, again, on these webinars, you are allowed to share. By all means, please do. Share the PowerPoint. If there's other information you're looking for, just let us know so we can get that to you. That's great. So the information about the URM students is of interest. What else?
Kathy, I have a question for our participants. While the study was designed to look at STEM service learning courses, how might these results kind of inform service learning across all disciplines? From our perspective, we feel like while it was focused on STEM and the efforts that we've been doing in the CCE to increase STEM service learning courses since 2010, that our findings around the landscape and the students' ratings as well as the faculty are indicative of what we would see system-wide. So I'd be interested in hearing from some of our faculty in the room around how do these studies help inform your teaching and learning, and how you would share that with your students who are taking a service learning course with you.
And just really quick, while people are thinking about that, two things came in on the chat. One is a question, but first I want to just let everybody know there was an earlier question about citations for the instruments. Rebecca just put those in the chat for everybody to see. And then the question that came in is, I would like to know where you can get the data for the service learning results so you can do some in-depth analysis on those data.
Judy, you want to comment on the data?
I think that is a Nicole question. Is my understanding that this question is asking whether our raw data would be available to other researchers?
It's not clear. So yes, that is the question.
Go ahead, Nicole, if you want to answer. I'll just say I think our IRB restricts it to the research team, but I would say this though, because we haven't published our final report yet, we'd be happy to do some additional analyses. If someone has something they'd like to know, we'd be happy to inform that part of our research process, and we can run those. So we could do that. I don't know that our data set necessarily is available given our IRB restrictions, but I would say I'd be happy to, again, if you have some ideas, be happy to do that. And maybe, again, based on Diane's question, maybe we can re-examine the idea of, like, you know, differences between male and female or something that that we want to investigate. So if you have any other thoughts or suggestions, I'd love to be able to integrate those now, and then we can, you know, put those findings out there when we put everything else in our final report.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was going to say what, similar to Rebecca, that we just want to make sure that we review the language that we used in our IRB, and just to double check what restrictions we put on for the sharing of data.
Okay, and with Rebecca mentioning the final report, and this relates to a question that just came in, or a comment really, Brianna, I'm just going to read it. It may be nice to have a one-page handout that summarizes the findings so we can distribute widely. And I just want to let folks know that, again, things are in the works. So we have the final report is in the works, so we'll have that this summer. prior to that, we'll have an executive summary of what we've just shared here so that you'll be able to share that with other folks. We'll also have, our website will be live in April, so you'll be able to point folks to the web to look at this data and others. So we do have a couple of different ways, things that are on the way, and we will definitely make sure that everyone who signed up for this webinar will get information about those pieces when they're live, and when the PDFs are available and whatnot, we'll get them out, we'll push them out to everyone.
Awesome. And then there's also another Q&A that it's really just a comment from Karina and Juan. I think that these 8 elements can be used to focus our curriculum development efforts, particularly with your results regarding linking to academic connections, collaboration, and values focus.
That's great. Thanks, Karina and Juan.
Oh, and then actually,
we were hoping that would happen. We were hoping you'd say that. Go ahead, Brianna.
Yeah, and then there was a follow-up from both of them. Have you considered replicating the study for service learning in general beyond STEM?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Judy, you want to comment?
Yeah, we have been talking about how we, if we engaged in an additional version of this study and extending it, whether we do a longitudinal and follow these students further, whether we do a historical analysis. We've been discussing whether we would do a similar study, opening it up to other disciplines. And I think we first want to, while we're definitely interested in all of that, we first want to share these findings and support the campuses in using them and helping to inform kind of the work that we're doing system-wide. One of the pieces that I will be looking into is having a system-wide webinar where we do a reconstruction of our course syllabus with faculty across the system. And so be on the lookout for that. I will be sending that information out in the coming weeks as well.
Can I just say something? I saw a comment from someone. I would like to also add, I have renewed interest in reviewing service learning syllabi from a campus to determine if components of high quality service learning are present and obvious for students. I think that's an excellent point, Diane. And I think for me, I feel like that's the biggest kind of low-hanging fruit for next steps for this. At the very least, if you're not able to provide really robust faculty development, at the very least, as a check on what's happening in the course, you can look at that syllabus and be able to figure out if some of these essential elements are really communicated to students, as just in terms of expectations for the class. As I mentioned, we had the Heffernan scale or a rubric. Actually, I'll put that in the chat too, but that is what was used as a basis for determining these elements for each syllabus that was rated. So I think that's something that you could easily do really quickly and be able to have some at least initial check of quality, not getting into any further depth before you even examine additional professional development or other things for faculty that you can do to support this.
What other questions do you have? It's what, 12:43. I wonder, Judy, if we go on to the next slide and sort of just give everyone a sense of what's happening next and where they can find us. If you look here again, like I mentioned before, we'll have a website that's going live in April. The address is there, so you'll be able to see everything that we shared here, along with the instruments as well. And again, we will make sure that we let all of you know when that actually goes live. So just as a reminder.
So I think with that, we will be coming to a close with our webinar. I thank you all for listening in today and with your thoughtful questions. I'm really excited about this research study and what we've learned thus far. And while there's been lots of national studies across the country, this is the first time we've conducted one of this depth in the CSU. And I think it's critical, especially because we have the most diverse student body. And I think this will help inform the work that's taking place around meeting the President's Council's report to increase 1 million STEM graduates. But more importantly, to really address some of our democratic engagement issues that we're having in our country today. And I think these findings are really an opportunity to see that service learning really does benefit students' civic engagement attitudes and behaviors, as well as their career and interests, whether they learn themselves that this is the place for them or that, it really isn't for them. And so what we can do with these studies, with the findings of these studies to support our students, I think is just a stepping stone. And so I hope you will continue to join me and your community engagement colleagues on each of our campuses to really make these experiences as the highest quality possible. And so I thank you all for your commitment to this really important work. And I also want to thank my team that I've worked with so closely for the last 5 years. I don't know what we'll do, not talking as often as we do after this summer, but I have an inclination we will continue to work together. And we really have approached this in a collaborative method from start to finish. And so thank you, Kathy, Rebecca, and Nicole. It has been a real joy to work on this with you. And thank you all again. Look out for the website and our materials coming out next month. And we hope that you continue to reach out to us if you do have questions. And so I want to make sure that you have our contact information as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.